Welcome to accommodate this, and welcome to the fourth and final video in a short series covering the history of disability benefits in the United States. In the previous three videos, we covered the history leading to the establishment of the NIH and Social Security, the history leading to the establishment of Medicaid and Medicare, and the history leading to the passing of the Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990. Both the Cold War and Gulf War ended in 1991, and by 1992, the budget for the NIH was so great, it accounted for nearly 1% of the entire federal government's operating budget, controlled more than 50% of all funding for health research, and 85% of all funding for health studies in universities. Before that time, the government had approached Supplemental Security Income, or SSI, as if it were an adult welfare category, but reports showed that 16% of SSI recipients turned out to be children. That meant a disability determination system intended to serve people who had been in the labor force was forced to handle many claims from children. And once again, the government was faced with possibly redefining how disability benefits are handled. In 1993, the Human Genome Project was declared complete because it reached the end of the originally estimated timeline. However, it only included 92% of the genome at that point, so an extension was necessary. That same year, the Disability Program Administration accounted for over half of the Social Security Administration's administrative expenses. So the Social Security Administration created the Disability Process Reengineering Team, or DPRT, to rethink and redesign the agency's disability programs to achieve dramatic improvements. In 1994, the Clinton administration passed the Don't Ask, Don't Tell bill, which forced LGBTQ military members to remain closeted or face being discharged from the military. This was based on the stigma that built during the AIDS epidemic in the 1980s, and the stereotype that gay men were predators who would undermine the unifying integrity of fellow military service members. And it resulted in the discharge of thousands of brave service members for nearly 2 decades. While this bill is not the focus of this video, it did contribute to a loss of employment and poor mental health for LGBTQ military service members, and therefore had a significant impact on communities across the country. Yet it was generally left out of legislation aimed at addressing unemployment and mental health. Meanwhile, back in 1994, Social Security Commissioner Shirley Chater approved the plan for a new disability claim process, which was prepared by the DPRT. The goals of the plan were to make the process more user-friendly for claimants, to make decisions as quickly as possible, to make the right decision the first time, and to make the process more efficient. The original redesign plan included 83 initiatives to be implemented within 6 years, 38 of which were to be completed within the first 2 years. However, this was criticized as being too ambitious. In 1996, the Social Security Administration acknowledged the challenges of the redesign plan were causing implementation problems. The same year, the government passed the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act of 1996, or HIPAA, an important act that regulated eligibility requirements for health insurance and established patient rights, including privacy regulations still in effect today. In 1997, the Social Security Administration issued a scaled-back redesign plan that focused on testing and implementation of 8 key initiatives, 5 near-term and 3 long-term, within 9 years. The administration assumed it could move focus of its disability determination from medical diagnosis to functional capacity using medical expertise, advisory communities, and outside experts to standardize protocols and instruments to measure functional ability. However, they soon learned few such instruments for measuring functional capacity existed, and the knowledge to develop additional instruments was lacking. They ended up having 10 states test the four most successful redesign elements, which included changes in the roles of the disability examiner and medical consultant, improved initial level documentation to make decisions more consistent, provisions for a claimant conference before a less than fully favorable decision, and eliminated the reconsideration step to streamline the process. Nothing significant was passed in 1998. However, in 1999, some significant events occurred. First, the lawsuit known as Sutton v. United Airlines, Inc., which impacted the Americans with Disabilities Act, or ADA, was brought to the Supreme Court. Basically, a woman was denied disability status for her loss of vision because the court believed she could have taken measures to correct her vision, such as wearing eyeglasses or contact lenses. So the court decided that mitigating measures should be taken into account when determining whether one's impairment constitutes a disability under the ADA. And this left many disabled individuals vulnerable to losing benefits or not being considered eligible at all if the assessor believed the individual had options, whether those options were available to them or not. This case was later overturned by passage of the ADA Amendments Act of 2008. The Families of Children with Disabilities Support Act of 1999 was also passed that same year to assist states in developing and enhancing systems of family support. It limited the amount of assistance that could be given to the families of disabled recipients to 75% of the cost for 3 years. It also established contracts and agreements to provide technical assistance to enhance these systems. And finally, it provided for a national grant program. Also in 1999, the Ticket to Work and Work Incentives Improvement Act of 1999 was passed. This opened the possibilities for disability beneficiaries to seek employment services and other support services needed to help them reduce their dependence on cash benefits. It established the Ticket to Work and Self-Sufficiency Program, allowing disability beneficiaries to seek employment services, vocational rehabilitative services, or other support services needed to regain or maintain employment and reduce their dependence on cash benefits. Essentially, yet again, the importance of rehabilitation was being reasserted. It included a buy-in option for Medicare coverage for working-aged persons with disabilities, and expedited reinstatement of benefits without requiring a new application if terminated benefits were the result of work activity. Beneficiaries with a ticket would not be subjected to medical disability reviews, and evidence of work would not be used to demonstrate medical improvement. This significantly simplified the eligibility review process and administrative costs of the disability program. It also empowered the Social Security Administration to conduct demonstration projects that would test out ideas aimed at reducing benefits over a certain amount. In 2000, a working draft of the complete human genome was announced. The National Institute of Biomedical Imaging and Bioengineering Establishment Act of 2000 was also passed, reforming aspects of the Public Health Service Act of 1944 related to biological research. The Children's Health Act of 2000 was passed the same year, which required the CDC to establish centers of excellence, which are groups of experts that can provide leadership, research, and support for various aspects of the disability program. At that time, more awareness was being raised about autism and other developmental disabilities, which had remained elusive for decades. But as our understanding began to expand, the government realized there were too few scientists and services available to support citizens with developmental disabilities, such as autism. This was part of the reason behind establishing centers of excellence, because we began to realize we were operating in ignorance, and we needed to invest in research of these developmental disabilities, which are fundamentally different and distinct from other more common disabilities. The Developmental Disabilities Assistance and Bill of Rights Act of 2000 was passed to fund programs to support people with developmental disabilities and their families. This act adds accountability for record-keeping requirements for entities receiving funds for disability programs. It also established affirmative action for employees with developmental disabilities, revising the Employment Rehabilitation Act of 1973 and the Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990. This is the first example of protections for the neurodivergent community becoming law, which includes protection and advocacy systems to protect the legal and human rights of individuals with developmental disabilities. This act also required states to establish advocacy councils and provide grants for individuals with developmental disabilities. Furthermore, it set the limit on cost shares to 80% to establish higher education for workers who assist individuals with developmental disabilities. The United States of America is almost 249 years old at the time of this recording. And even before this country was established, the pursuits of liberty and freedom have been ever present in this land. However, we may very well be witnessing the end of our freedoms as we know it under Trump's second term as president. It's easy to forget how far we've come, because today we have several strong communities fighting for rights. But in the beginning, there was no LGBTQ community, there was no disabled community, there were no communities fighting for equality and inclusion. And while we know there have always been disabled people, most people with disabilities were isolated from the rest of the world, and our voices taken from us for much of this nation's history. In 2001, papers describing the human genome were published, and the Social Security Advisory Board issued a report expressing concern about the future of the disability program. The board estimated that projected growth threatened to overwhelm an already inadequate policy and administrative structure, so they asked Congress to conduct an in-depth review of the disability programs and to determine what changes were necessary. They hoped changes would address the following issues: differences in denial and allowance rates over time among state agencies, complexity of decision-making due to court decisions made over time, qualifications of disability decision-makers varied from state to state, placing enormous stress on field offices, state agencies, and administrative law judges. And SSA's definition of disability was inconsistent with the ADA, and more could be done to encourage return to work, expressing hope that the Ticket to Work legislation would make policies more coherent. Also in 2001, the Muscular Dystrophy Community Assistance Research and Education Amendments of 2001 provided funding for various forms of muscular dystrophy, and the Hematological Cancer Research Investment and Education Act 2001 provided funding for various forms of blood cancer. In the late summer, everything shifted when terrorists attacked the World Trade Center in New York. In response, President George W. Bush announced a global war on terror that would last 20 years. As devastating as that was, it was also a unifying moment for the country that shifted a lot of people's feelings and views on life in this country. It was terrifying and beautiful at the same time. In 2002, another significant court case impacting the ADA had reached the Supreme Court. This was the case known as Toyota Motor Manufacturing Kentucky, Inc. v. Williams 2002. In this case, the Supreme Court provided their interpretation of what substantially impairs means under the ADA. The problem with their decision was that it drew attention away from whether discrimination had occurred. Later, the Court of Appeals reversed the decision, and this eventually led to passing of the ADA amendments of 2008, which will come up later in this video. In 2003, a more complete draft of the genome was published. At that point, the project was declared complete, though finishing work continued for 2 more decades. Also in 2003, Helen Viola Jackson, the last surviving widow of a Civil War veteran, died, ending the payment of Civil War pension benefits. In 2004, human sequencing was reported to cover 99% of the human genome with 99.99% accuracy, though 92% of sampling exceeded that level of accuracy. The same year, President George W. Bush passed the No Child Left Behind Act of 2004, or NCLB, which required funds of financial incentives meant for special education services when it was clear that those programs did nothing to improve education results. This was measured with the introduction of the Adequate Yearly Progress, or AYP test, which was intended to provide benchmarks and progress on goals in special education. Hurricane Katrina struck the United States in 2005, which was considered one of the worst natural disasters in U.S. history. Executive orders were passed to help pay for restoration efforts to help recover from the disaster. This added some additional strain to the healthcare system, which was not set up to absorb the costs of such an intense disaster outside of a war. Though nobody was to blame for the disaster, it raised concerns over climate change and how we needed to prepare for similar disasters in years to come. It also had an impact on the cost of healthcare coverage in the private sector. In 2006, the very last chromosome sequence was published, which was the same year the Combating Autism Act of 2006 was passed. The name of this act was controversial, and various portions of the act approached autism from a perspective of preventing the disorder. However, later on, we will find this perspective changes when scientists realize that that is the wrong approach. Until then, this act rewrote the Public Health Service Act of 1944 by adding provisions governing NIH research on autism. This is the primary act providing funding for autism research and services. Unlike other disabilities, the government understood there are no simple tests for autism, so diagnosis required substantial training. Much of the funding granted by the Combating Autism Act of 2006 was meant for training people to properly screen for autism. Researchers were also required to track numbers and differences in numbers year after year. So in 2006, they estimated 1 out of 110 children were autistic. The following year, the Newborn Screening Saves Lives Act of 2007 was passed to provide grants for programs concerning newborn screenings, education, and outreach. This was the government's response to learning how important early interventions can be. After much dispute, the ADA Amendments Act of 2008, also known as ADAAA, was passed to overturn 2 controversial court decisions based on interpretation of the ADA. Those were the Sutton v. United Airlines, Inc. and Toyota Motor Manufacturing Kentucky, Inc. v. Williams. It was clear that courts were focusing on whether the plaintiff was disabled rather than if discrimination had occurred. Reversal of these decisions made it easier for individuals to seek protection under the ADA to establish they have a disability within the original meaning. In 2009, a more accurate version of the human genome was released, but still contained more than 300 gaps. This was the same year that the H1N1 flu pandemic hit. H1N1 was a version of the swine flu, a strain of the flu that had evolved in pigs but was mostly a new strain never experienced by human beings. So people did not have established antibodies to fight this strain of the flu, resulting in more severe and even lethal flu infections. It was a significant outbreak, considered a pandemic, affecting 74 countries around the world, and contributed to rising healthcare costs in the US. In 2010, President Barack Obama took action to address the concerning rate at which healthcare costs were rising. Besides the H1N1 pandemic, healthcare had been steadily becoming more and more expensive for several years. If it were to continue at the same rate, estimates were that it would collapse our healthcare infrastructure within 5 years. So President Obama fought hard to pass the Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act of 2010, soon after renamed to simply the Affordable Care Act, or ACA. Opponents of the act referred to it as Obamacare, which proponents quickly adopted as a label of pride. The ACA was a transformative act which added provisions to overhaul the health insurance market. It established basic standards to regulate health insurance companies, which made it possible for people to more easily compare plans and choose according to their needs and financial standing. Prior to this act, insurance companies could establish health insurance plans without any consistency in coverage options, could avoid paying out due to pre-existing conditions, and could terminate covered children once they reached age 18. This act addressed all of those issues and more, ensuring all emergent care was covered for everyone, established standard plan options, eliminated pre-existing conditions, raised the covered child age to 26, and established the marketplace where citizens could shop for coverage, whether it was offered by the state, the federal government, or private companies. In 2011, the United Nations launched World Autism Awareness Day to help raise awareness and acceptance for autism. The theme for 2011 was Toward Autonomy and Self-Determination, and they continued to have a new theme each year ever since. That same year, the Obama administration finally put an end to the harmful Don't Ask, Don't Tell policy that tarnished the reputation of the military and resulted in discriminatory discharges of thousands of military service members. The Civil Rights Act of 2012 prohibits LGBT discrimination in federal assisted housing programs. That same year, the EEOC ruled employment discrimination based on gender identity or transgender status should be prohibited as well. In 2013, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, also known as DSM-5, eliminated Asperger's syndrome and merged it with autism spectrum disorder, or ASD. The Pandemic and All Hazards Preparedness Reauthorization Act of 2013 was also passed to extend, fund, and improve several programs designed to prepare the United States and health professionals in the event of a pandemic, epidemic, or biological, chemical, radiological, or nuclear accident or attack. One product from the effort leading up to this act included a strategy guide for future administrations. Much of this was put together after years of study and planning after dealing with the H1N1 pandemic from 2009. In 2014, the U.S. government passed the Autism Collaboration, Accountability, Research, Education, and Support Act of 2014, or Autism Cares Act of 2014. This was essentially a new name for the Combating Autism Reauthorization Act, passed in 2006. The Autism Cares Act also reauthorized research, surveillance, and education activities related to autism spectrum disorders conducted by various agencies within the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, or HHS. Those activities are conducted by the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, or the CDC, the Health Resources and Services Administration, and the National Institutes of Health, or NIH. The act was given a lifetime of 5 years, at which time the act would be re-evaluated. In 2015, only 160 gaps remained in the human genome. The year 2016 was a tumultuous year consumed with the presidential election between Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump. Most people believed Hillary would win and decided not to vote, which ensured Trump's win. The following year, in 2017, President Trump tweeted that transgender individuals would no longer be able to enter the military, and those currently enlisted would not be allowed to continue their roles. This triggered several lawsuits fighting back against the discrimination. That same year, the Autism Cares Act was amended and reauthorized for another 5 years. The amendment was expanded to include autistic individuals of all ages, not just children, focusing on programs in areas with a shortage of personal health services and to reduce health outcome disparities across diverse populations. Then COVID-19 hit the US toward the end of that year. That brings us to 2020, when the Trump administration, based on recommendations from the CDC and NIH, reluctantly issued shutdowns to control the spread of COVID-19. The Trump administration refused to adhere to the guidelines established by the Pandemic and All Hazards Preparedness Reauthorization Act of 2013, which was passed under the Obama administration. The decision to ignore those regulations and reluctance to enforce shutdowns and the usage of safety masks undermined efforts to control the spread of the virus, which not only killed millions of US citizens, but also had huge impacts on the mental health of the survivors. That same year, the Supreme Court ruled that discrimination on the basis of sex includes discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation and gender identity, aligning with the EEOC's definition in the ADA. A viable vaccine was discovered before winter, but was made controversial by President Trump, who spread misinformation and discouraged vaccination. This fed into the already public misunderstanding that vaccines caused autism, a fact that has been debunked time and again. Combined with the confusion and uncertainty of the pandemic, this worsened the stigma against autism and perpetuated a decline in autistic mental health. And scientists reported that only 79 unresolved gaps remained, accounting for 5% of the human genome. January 6, 2021, President Trump incited an insurrection at the U.S. Capitol in Washington, D.C., in an effort to stop certification of the 2020 election results. He was unsuccessful, and President Joe Biden was inaugurated a couple of weeks later. President Biden helped organize distribution of the COVID-19 vaccines and mandated vaccination for public-facing workers, an act that was considered controversial despite its proven life-saving effects. He also issued a rule change to the Housing and Urban Development Act to expand the definition of sex to include sexual orientation and gender identity, based on the 2020 Supreme Court decision. In 2021, the global war on terror ended, and President Biden rescinded the ban on transgender people serving in the military. That same year, scientists reported the complete genome was within reach, with potential issues remaining for only 0.3% of the base chromosomes and all but 5 unresolved gaps. The Suicide Training and Awareness Nationally Delivered for Universal Protection Act of 2021, or Stand Up Act of 2021, passed to provide best practices on student suicide awareness and prevention training. And that was for kindergarten through 12th grade, school-based suicide awareness and prevention training. This act, though admirable in its intent, did not provide strategies to address the rates of suicide for LGBTQ students. At the time of this recording, no suicide prevention extracurricular act has yet to be passed for businesses and other public places, nor any act addressing the needs of LGBTQ citizens, autistic citizens, or other marginalized groups. And that's not to say that the government is not taking any action on the topic of suicide for those populations, but aside from the Stand Up Act, they have established little more than telephone helplines and an awareness campaign. There just hasn't been any other legislation passed to address the issue. In 2022, the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Fourth Circuit stated that the ADA covers individuals with gender dysphoria, which may aid transgender people in accessing legal protections. Autism counts that year were estimated at 1 out of 44, a significant increase since the previously reported numbers from 2006. And the final gapless assembly of the genome was finally finished for all 24 chromosomes. In 2023, the final genome was published. Autism counts were estimated at 1 out of 36, attributed mostly to improved training for clinicians who diagnosed autism, an overall better understanding of the condition, and better techniques for recognizing autism. In 2024, the Public Health Service Act of 1994 was amended to include budget changes, providing more money for research and interventions through the autistic person's lifespan, not just childhood. Unfortunately, Donald Trump won the 2024 election for president again, and he's been very vocal about his thoughts and plans for the disabled community, none of them positive. The Trevor Project reported an increase of 700% for crisis calls on election night compared to the 2 weeks prior. Trump's second administration could not only prove to be a barrier to more people receiving disability benefits, but may also serve to eliminate many of the freedoms we have. Despite the passage of protective laws and executive orders, this country has a major problem with accepting equal rights for marginalized communities. You saw how many times we've had to pass new acts and amendments just to get people to accept African American citizens, and various levels of discrimination against them, against women, natives, immigrants, transgender people, and the disabled still occur to this day. Advancements in our understanding of developmental disabilities and other conditions are constantly growing, and laws are continually expanding to afford disabled people with equal rights. But there's no denying the fact that misunderstandings of autism still linger. And there's still a lack of consistency in enforcing those laws, especially those not codified into the Constitution. We are only a little more than a month into Trump's second administration, and he has already repealed almost every executive order President Biden signed to protect marginalized citizens. And Trump, along with his billionaire bureaucrats, seem determined to dismantle all agencies that provide support, education, resources, and outreach for marginalized communities. They are actively implementing Project 2025, which includes spreading misinformation, shutting down the Department of Education, closing research facilities, stripping rights away from the LGBTQ community, laying off millions of government employees, threatening life-saving programs and institutions such as USAID, Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security, denying women bodily autonomy, deporting immigrants and their families, rejecting the very concepts of strength through diversity, equal rights for all, and including everyone at the table, reversing decades of advancement in human rights, and establishing a Christian nation of white supremacists. All of this and more illustrates we have a long way yet to go toward full acceptance of marginalized citizens, including those of us with disabilities. The amount of money paid to recipients of Social Security benefits are greater for those that apply for benefits at a more advanced age. For instance, those who apply at age 62 may receive around $2,800 per month. If they wait to apply when they are 66 or 67, they may earn around $4,000 per month. And if they wait until 70, they may earn around $5,100 per month. The idea is that the older they are, the fewer years they have left to live, and therefore they can consume their benefits in larger portions. However, those amounts are based on the non-disabled population. If you are forced into early retirement due to disability, you earn even less. On average, those on Social Security disability insurance earn around $960 per month, or $1,450 per month per couple. And if you also benefit from other social services, such as food stamps, elder care, child welfare, substance abuse treatment, domestic violence support, job training, or living in a homeless shelter, those costs will be deducted from your Social Security benefits. And if you try to supplement your Social Security benefits by working, a tenet previously valued for making people more independent, you are penalized further. In fact, for every $2 earned from working, $1 will be deducted from your Social Security income. Currently, anyone earning $687.50 per month in the 48 contiguous states and DC, or $860 per month in Alaska and Hawaii, are considered impoverished. That means the average disabled person on Social Security disability insurance is hovering just above or below the poverty line. They are penalized for trying to gain independence or for relying on other services established to assist marginalized citizens. And even if the disabled person has paid into the system much of their life, the majority conservative perception is that it is an entitlement they don't deserve. During his 2024 presidential campaign, Trump promised that he and the GOP would not touch Social Security, Medicare, or Medicaid. However, Elon Musk, the richest man in the world, who was not elected by the people, is in charge of making cuts to programs he considers to be waste and abuse. Already, cuts are being made to Medicaid, and cuts to Medicare and Social Security are imminent. The Conservative Party has control of the White House, the House of Representatives, the Senate, and the Supreme Court. At no other time in history have we faced a more fascist, far-right regime. So we are in new territory, but that doesn't mean we don't know where we are headed. History has shown us that these social benefits contribute to the health and happiness of our nation as a whole. Keeping people in poverty has been proven to contribute to more medical costs, more homelessness, more crime and abuse, and more strain on our economy. I fear for the terrors we are about to face, but standing down is not an option. I hope this series has been informative and given you some perspective of what we stand to lose. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please comment, like, and subscribe to see more content like this, or click on the video here to continue watching.